My name is Stephen Lee Williams. I am doing my book review for Professor Lockhart Gilroy's class on Almeda Wright's The Spiritual Lives of Young African Americans. Wright introduces her book with a clear presentation of the problem, as she sees it. As Mark Sorensen discussed in his presentation, that is the problem of fragmented spirituality and sense of self among young African Americans, which reflects a problem in the US society at large. This means that Black youth see God as being active in some areas of their lives, but non-existent or absent in others. That they believe that God saves, but societal ills and systemic problems have nothing to do with God. Wright says that individual youth with fragmented spirituality are not necessarily at risk, but that the African American community and church are at risk if they perpetuate youth participation in the mythology that the personal and the communal are separate, or that the spiritual and the political are separate. The purpose of Wright's book is twofold. One, to explore and clarify the experience and components of fragmented spirituality among African American youth, and two, to explore alternatives to fragmentation and propose a pedagogy that fosters a more integrated spirituality. Wright poses two guiding questions. One, how and why are African American Christian adolescents experiencing fragmentation in their spirituality? And two, what can we do to foster an integrating spirituality, specifically in terms of theological claims and pedagogical frameworks? Wright offers practical theological analysis of these questions based in a methodology of meta-ethnography or knowledge synthesis, which gathers the collective wisdom of a group by highlighting their shared stories and the common threads between them. In chapter 1, she shares the personal stories of youth she has interviewed and the connecting points thereof. The collective themes that she highlights are communal concerns, particularly school and friends, their experiences of church, God's activity in their personal lives, community, government, and world, and their communal involvement, including their motivations for service and God's calling to work for change. She argues that the focus of Black churches on personal theology is a recipe for fragmentation. In chapter 2, Wright places fragmentation in a larger context, using resources from the fields of psychology, sociology, and practical theology, and engages several conversation partners in developing an understanding of selfhood in the context of community. This understanding is crucial to our work in ministering to young African Americans as it prepares us for the next chapter, which is devoted to African American spirituality, cultural norms of interdependence, and the meaning of conversion as a reorientation to liberation. It also sets up Wright's exploration in later chapters of the problems of suffering particular to Black youth and of non-church settings in which Black youth experience a sense of community and meaning. Thus, I will spend some time with this topic. Wright leads with an examination of W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness as a defining survival trait of African Americans and places it in the context of the experience of modern Black youth. She includes a discussion of fragmentation and identity development that draws on Fowler's stages of faith and Erickson's theories from which Fowler draws. Notably, she spends significant time on Erickson's model of mutual interpersonal perspective taking and his concept of the tyranny of the they, or anxiety over what one perceives others perceive about them. She notes that the tyranny includes an added layer for Black teens interfacing with American white-dominated culture's oppressive, negative, and violent views of them. Wright draws on Janie Ward's expansion on the crisis of identity versus role confusion to include both identity and theology. Ward defines identity as knowing who you are and ideology as knowing what you believe. The resolution of the crisis requires all adolescents to first proclaim, "I am not," before knowing, "I am." It requires Black teens to add, "I am not what you believe Black people to be, and I am Black." Wright then introduces the idea that identity is not static, but an ongoing process of integration. Integration refers to the ability to incorporate one's experiences into their sense of self, what Michael Nakula calls a coherent and evolving interpretation of who we are. Wright concludes that adolescent identity formation entails an ongoing, never static process of integration and moving toward an inner sense of firmness. This firmness is the antidote to fragmentation. The logical follow-up question, of course, is that if identity formation is ongoing, then what is fragmentation? Wright offers a version of integration that accounts for its organic nature. The idea of populated and plural selves. She writes, "People can hold diverse forces together without losing the complexity and multiplicity that these forces bear. They can hold together plural selves in an integrated fashion." Wright draws on postmodern ideas of selfhood to support this claim. The modernist view that the essence of the human is individual rationality led to an invention of the idea of the autonomous self in the 18th century, on which the field of psychology is based. This reminds us that, quote, "psychology has never been value-free, because it is based on an assumption that a person should be autonomous and coherent, rather than interconnected and evolving. Thus, our dominant cultural understanding of identity is rooted in a flawed model." Kenneth Gergen introduces a postmodernist view of the populating of the self, due to the saturation of information, relationships, and feelings that essentially mean we are different aspects of ourselves in different settings, and that this is okay. In the positive, this loss of a concept of true self could set the stage for, quote, "moving beyond the individualist tradition," and empowering us to realize the tremendous significance of relationships for our lives. In the negative extreme, however, it could lead to the fragmenting of the individual, as more freedom leads to more relationships, which lead to competing values and priorities, which lead to inadequacy and self-doubt. As a corrective of this peril, Wright invokes the discipline of practical theology, particularly the work of Kenda Creasy-Dean. Dean views fragmentation as harmful because humans are, quote, "homo religiosus," meaning that they have a God-given identity, a term Wright finds problematic because it is based on an individualistic understanding of the world and, quote, "does not attend to other God-given identities of community, culture, race, gender, etc." However, Wright agrees with Dean that the non-fragmented plural selves are compatible with Christianity because Christian identity is inherently relational, and the plural selves are formed in a relationship, which we will talk about in a moment. What is needed, Wright concludes, is not to recreate a world where youth are not exposed to multiple ideas and values, but to learn with youth how they can make sense of and hold on to these sometimes competing voices and values. Wright's answer for how to do so involves, quote, embracing the communal and relational selves, end quote. She discusses one African view of selves, which is that people cannot be defined in isolation. There is no self apart from the from a pre-existing and conditional we. Such a view is very different from the American individualist perspective that relationships are a threat to one's independence. It is within this individualist paradigm that the African American youth exist, suffer, and resist. For the purposes of this presentation, I will skip to chapter 4, in which Wright uses Black youth's slam poetry as a basis for discussing theodicy, or the theology of suffering. While Wright is careful to emphasize that suffering is by no means the only defining experience of African American youth, the church's inability to adequately address the problem of suffering is a key factor in the problem of fragmentation. To me, it is a key reason that churches of all sorts are unable to meet the needs of youth, and certainly a point of dissonance and struggle for Black youth and other youth of color in my own mostly white denomination. In her opening paragraph, Wright says there is an often unspoken issue at the center of African American youth's fragmented spirituality, in that for some youth it is easier to have no expectation that God should work in particular areas of their life than to wrestle with questions of how a good God could not respond to the concerns of Black youth. African American youth experience evil and suffering in ways that are incomprehensible to the wider society, end quote. Wright's goal in this chapter is to, quote, start with the voices of young African American youth in order to both learn more about their experiences of evil and suffering, and to listen carefully for what they can teach the African American Christian community and society in general. This is her, quote, honest attempt to walk with young people, learning from their reflections and helping create new models, end quote, to engage these questions. Wright discusses the form and function of spoken word among Black youth in a way that is instructive for we in the ministry who wish to take on a similarly honest attempt at accompaniment and collaboration with young African Americans. She speaks highly of the spoken words forms transgression of rigid boundaries between public, private, and personal communal. She says it serves a similar purpose as testimony and other communal sharing in that the sharing of testimonies leads to the possibility of solutions, both for the individual and for the community. Something Wright highlights from this survey of poetry and from her interviews in chapter 1 is that death is constantly on the minds of young African Americans. Among her observations, racism requires Black youth to be strong even in death. What does it mean to be a high school student whose most pressing concern is that someone could kill him at any given moment for no reason? And all the typical responses to this concern, go to school, don't resist, dress well, be a church kid, are inadequate to the point of being absurd. Such absurdity may account for this sobering, heartbreaking observation. As absent from any of their pieces is an idea that God would affirm their rage or fight with them against oppression. Wright notes that these youth's poems force us to wrestle with the prevalence of the ideal of suffering to make a situation better. She quotes Emily Towns on the theology of redemptive suffering. Any discussion that accepts suffering as good is susceptible to being shaped into a tool of oppression. Wright engages many formidable scholars in her book. As she winds this chapter up, though, she confesses none of these scholarly reflections or theodicies are sufficient to help youth who are already fragmenting their spiritual lives to make sense of their experiences of evil and or suffering. Earlier, she noted, I find that youth poets actually push beyond these scholarly reflections and offer insights that cannot be ignored by African American scholars and churches. As she concludes this chapter, Wright says, each young poet pushes us to ask, what would it look like to walk with African American youth as they balance attending to their experiences of suffering and learning to persist, resist, and transform their experiences and the world. African American youth do not need another theology of suffering. What I see as most needful and full-fledged, what I see as most needful is a full-fledged embracing of the questions and reflections of young people toward God and the world around them, end quote. Wright ends her book with a critical pedagogy for abundant life, a theology, she says, is robust enough to speak to the struggles of youth, for whom life is an increasingly fragile idea and death is a more prevalent reality. Wright models how to journey with youth to co-create the church we all need, valuing their opinions and lived experiences as truly sacred and valid. I hope you will read this book yourself. It is painstakingly researched and written and places the struggles of African American youth into a theological, historical, and social context that makes clear that the way forward into liberation is through collaboration and integration. Thank you.